The sermon actually today should say Nanette Smith, because we welcome Nanette. Smith is going to share her story this morning, and let's offer a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we are grateful for the opportunity to worship you and to hear one another's stories. We pray that you'd be with Nanette in her courage to share her story this morning. Amen. Well, we've been talking about mental health issues the last few weeks. Our sermon series, Stretched Thin. We've talked about depression, we've talked about anxiety, we've talked about stress. We've also discussed how, as Christians, we are not immune to these kinds of things, right? And that sometimes the answer to our prayer is medication and finding the right physician. That sometimes that is the answer to our prayer. So today we're focusing more on mental health disorders. There's a whole bunch of them that you can look up that are described. Things that are familiar to us, we may have heard about PTSD, post-traumatic stress, or OCD, people that have obsessive-compulsive behavior, eating disorders. There's all kinds of things that go under this group. But today we're going to talk, Nanette's going to share her story about living life as someone who has bipolar. Welcome, Nanette. We're so grateful for your sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you. What Pastor Meredith just listed is quite a list, but I am going to talk about just the one, bipolar disorder. In case some of you hadn't heard of bipolar, maybe you've heard of manic depression. That's what it used to be called. It's a disorder of the brain that causes a person to cycle between extreme mania or highs and deep depression. And each year, about 2.9% or 5.7 million people are affected by this disorder. Some famous people who have been afflicted were Ernest Hemingway, Vincent van Gogh, Beethoven, and the actress Vivian Leigh. I have lived with and will live with bipolar disorder every day of my life. Although it isn't curable, it is treatable. And through this dialogue with Pastor Meredith, I hope to give you some insight into what life is like with someone with mental illness, and to help erase some of the stigma about mental illness.
Exactly. So how long have you been a member of Holy Cross?
I'm a lifer. I've been here my entire life. I went through Sunday school, confirmation. I sang in the junior choir, went to VBS each year, participated in the high school youth group, and I was active in the musical group Crosswinds. As an adult, I directed the children's choir, and I have been active in the music program, singing with the celebration band and the chancel choir, the a cappella group. I play handbells, and I play in the recorder group. I sang with our contemporary choir, Celebration Singers, while it was still in existence. I co-found and lead DAF, the Adult with Disabilities group here at Holy Cross. I was chairperson of the Worship and Music Committee, as it was called back then, and I was on council. My point with all of this is that church has played an important part of my life, even though, and maybe perhaps because, I have bipolar. I found that being at church and worshiping was a help for me, and is a help for me. In fact, I don't know what I would do or would have done if it hadn't been for the church.
So when were you diagnosed, Nanette?
Well, until quite recently, it was felt that bipolar disorder would only present itself in teens or 20-year-olds. My case is completely different. I had unusual traits even as a baby and a young child. My mother and grandmother noticed that I was unusually sad, that I would become inappropriately angry at situations, and I spent a lot of time alone. As a small child, I would sit and replay my Wizard of Oz record over and over and over and over. Although although they felt this was not normal, back when I was little, children couldn't have any kind of mental illness.
That's right. So how about as you grew older? How did it develop?
Well, when I became a teenager, things spiraled more out of control. I was angry much of the time, and I fought with my mom daily. She literally had to drag me out of the house to take me to school. But once I was there, I acted normally. I did not want anyone to know how awful I felt. I was a good actor. Nobody noticed anything. In fact, people always looked at me as the girl who had it together.
Yep.
I still chuckle at that one, if they only knew. Mm-hmm. But because of the stigma, I had to hold it together, at least at school. I had a hallucination, and my only one, when I was 14, and that was when my mom first took me to see the doctor. I started seeing a therapist shortly after that. I resisted going, but my mom and dad basically told me that as long as I lived in their house, I would do as they say. Never did find a comeback for that one. By the time I was 20, my therapist sent me to a psychiatrist so that I could have meds prescribed. Fortunately, I found a wonderful psychiatrist/therapist that I still see today over 35 years later. He diagnosed me with bipolar when I was about 22. One thing I want to make clear: it is important to have talk therapy, not to just take medication.
So what else helped?
Music also played a large part of my life. I started playing piano when I was 8, and I began French horn at age 11. I could take out my anger, my frustration, my depression, and also my good feelings on the piano and the horn. It became a great outlet for me.
What would you share with parents of children under the age of 18 this morning?
My advice to you is that if your child, no matter what age, seems to show unusual characteristics, don't ignore them. Read as much as you can about children and teens and depression and anxiety and stress disorders. There is a lot of information out there now. Don't assume that just because your child isn't an adult yet, that mental disorders can't happen. The sooner they get help, the better the prognosis.
As you said earlier, those teen years became even more complicated for you.
Yes, they did, because teens also go through the hormonal changes. And when you combine that with the mental disorder, it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish between the two. Mm-hmm. But that's why reading about mental illness is so important. And although I was in therapy by my early teens, which was pretty unheard of back then, I still have bipolar disorder. No amount of healing and therapy, no amount of therapy can heal that. What therapy did do was to help me understand my issues and to help me process my emotions. As a teenager, not only did I have the undiagnosed bipolar, but I also had, of course, all the normal hormonal up and downs that all teenagers face. I would suggest that if you have any concerns, talk to a professional, either your child's doctor, a pastor, or a school counselor. Don't be afraid to admit there's a problem. Stigma is the greatest danger to those with a mental problem. Realize that it isn't something you did wrong, or that your child is just weak and should be able to handle things. Talk to your children. Find out what bothers them. Find out what they like. Get to know their friends.
It's also important for me to add at this point that this is really important to our ministry here at Holy Cross. We have offered 2 different sessions of NAMI, the National Association of Mental Illness. We've offered 2 sessions of a parent-to-parent group. The last one was early winter, and January, February, March, I should say. And it was even facilitated by one of our members here. A wonderful class to talk about that kind of thing for parents of adult children with mental illness. In the future, we hope to be able to offer a support group. We also hope to offer a class with NAMI's help and facilitation for a class parent-to-parent for people that have children under the age of 18. It's an important part of our ministry to be able to talk about these things. So when were you open about your diagnosis with others?
I wasn't open until I was in my 30s, and that was because of the stigma. I find the media is one big culprit, because anytime someone does something violent, they are labeled as mentally ill. And because of this, people are afraid that anyone who has a mental problem can and will become violent. And this is just not true. I feel that there is evil in this world that we can't always explain, even when we try to. Once I got into my 30s, I guess I decided that I would be open about having bipolar so I could hopefully counter the stigma and show others that bipolar doesn't mean you can't live a normal life. I guess I felt like I could be some kind of ambassador.
And you're a great one. So what helped you through the tough times?
My extremely supportive parents, my faith, my church, music, and now my wonderful husband. It is important to have a network of people to be able to turn to.
So can you explain a little bit how your bipolar manifested itself?
Well, as I stated earlier, I was an unusually sad child, and I became a depressed teen. I had the first of my suicide attempts when I was a senior in high school. When I was in college, I had my first real manic episode. I spent almost a semester living on 3 to 4 hours of sleep. My thoughts were racing, and I felt like I could do just about anything. And I have to admit, it was quite appealing after all my depressive times. The huge problem with a manic episode is that there's always a crash, which means you fall back into a deep depression. I literally crashed within a matter of minutes. This depression was like none I had ever known, which triggered my second suicide attempt.
So what helped?
My doctor and family helped me get back to a normal state, but it was the medication that really helped get me back on track. My meds had to be adjusted, which adjusting medication is a lifelong process, which it is for most illnesses.
For many, yep.
I have been hospitalized 3 times to help stabilize my moods. Proper medication is important, and equally important is taking them. Some people start to feel better, so they stop the meds because they feel that they are healed. Another issue with the medication for bipolar is that it evens out your moods. This can make life seem rather boring compared to the ups and downs of bipolar. For me, I would much rather have that feeling than the mania and depression. So I just look at it as people having to take medications for a variety of illnesses.
Right.
So why would my taking meds for mental health be looked at any differently?
Exactly.
And I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that things were all hunky-dory after that. Uneven treated bipolar can rear its ugly head again and again. My last suicide attempt happened 6 months after Phil and I were married. I was told that I was one red light away from dying. Because of that incident, I went through ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, or shock therapy, which is pretty much a last resort for treating bipolar. It basically resets the brain. This did help me. However, it took a very long time for me to recover. I compare it to having a major surgery. It can take a long time for that person to recover, and life will probably never be quite the same.
So, brag a little bit. You talked about your music. Brag a little bit for us in terms of your music career. It's wonderful to hear what she has done.
Well, music, as I stated, was one of the things that helped me with my feelings. When I started French horn, I immediately knew that I someday wanted to play it professionally. Don't ask me how I knew that, but I did. I was very single-minded, and I think I get that as one of my traits from bipolar. I did work and got a 4-year scholarship to Madison, started playing professionally while I was there, and moved back to Milwaukee when I graduated. From there, I slowly started to play professionally. It takes time to break into the music scene. Eventually, I was performing with the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, Skylight Theater, the Florentine Opera, the Milwaukee Ballet, and any Broadway shows that came to town. I also played with a variety of smaller groups in and around Milwaukee, Madison, and with a highly praised orchestra in Chicago. I had a private horn studio and taught at Carthage College in UW Parkside. I was asked to do a master's degree at UWM, and I received a university fellowship, and I was the first music student to ever receive one, and they actually paid me to go to school. Pretty good, huh? When I started playing professionally, I was the only woman horn player around Milwaukee. This has fortunately changed, but looking back on it, it's a pretty good feeling.
Absolutely. What an amazing career. You've also had blessings that many people with these type of disorders are not fortunate to have. Share a little bit about that.
Well, I have been blessed to be married to Phil Smith since 1998.
Yay, Phil.
Yay, Phil. And I know the Lord has brought him to me in my life. And even after my breakdown 6 months into our marriage, he stayed by my side, which is very amazing. He has been an amazing partner and support in my journey. I have also had the blessing of my family, my mom, my dad while he was alive, and my brother. My mom has been particularly supportive throughout my life, and she's put up with me fighting with her every day, and especially lately. And I have been blessed with some true friends who are always there for me. One of the things that I feel blessed about is that my parents had good insurance, and my husband's insurance now. I also am on disability, so I do receive disability Social Security from the government. It is difficult sometimes for people because of the insurance issues. Although, for someone looking to be on disability, I urge you not to become discouraged because it can take a little while to get on that. Also, laws are changing so that insurance companies have to offer as much coverage for mental, psychological issues as they do for physical issues. So that's gradually changing, which is a very good thing.
Is there a particular Bible verse that speaks to you?
Well, when I get very angry and when I'm mad at God, I remember the verses that Jesus cried out from the cross from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And I can get really angry, shake my fist and cry and all that. But really, the verses that speak to me are from Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thoughts from afar. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them.
One more thing. If you hadn't struggled enough in life, tell the congregation what happened in 1997 that changed the course of your life.
In 1997, I developed a condition called focal dystonia. It affected the muscles in my embouchure, which is this where I put my mouthpiece, so I couldn't control them consistently anymore. So this caused me to have to give up playing professionally. So I had to rethink who I was. I always thought of myself as Nanette, the horn player. It was a devastating time, and it took a lot of reflection and praying to come through it. But I have finally come to terms with that.
So Nanette, you've never defined yourself as being a bipolar person, that's the essence of who you are. Then you had to realize that you weren't no longer defining yourself as a horn player. So how do you define yourself?
I am a child of God.
Amen. Let's thank Nanette. Thank you.